we just had the biggest demand shock. We laid off 30 million employees, and our wages increased. When I saw a statistic, I'm like, how the hell did that happen?
What does it mean, Rogo?
So no one told you that we were gonna do less.
What
All right.
the hell was that?
So that was
We're cutting that.
That was gonna be our intro music, but luckily, this is a shout out I wanted to give for the past couple episodes. We have our friend Josh Karnofsky, who did the revamp of our intro music, make it intro music to sound better. So if you noticed that in the last couple episodes, that's all Josh. I'll give you his details in the description to give him a follow. And thanks, Josh, for helping us out. We have another friend with us today, Rogo. He's going to be talking to us about some things on his mind. We're happy to have him back. He was a guest a bunch of episodes ago, and so he killed it. So we decided it's time to bring him back on. And Rogo, how you doing?
Thanks, Sean. I'm doing well. I'm happy to be on the Do Less podcast. Always good to kick it with you guys.
Nice. All right, Dale, take it away.
Yeah, happy to have you. Welcome back, listeners. So Paul Rogovsky, welcome back to the pod. I know you wanted to focus on supply chains today. I'm going to kick it to you just to kind of give us an intro on where your head's at. And what do you think something that the listeners need to be thinking about and focusing on?
Yeah. So I told Brendan, Jeff, and John I wanted to come on to the podcast. I'm an avid listener, and there's been a lot of discussion about monetary policy, fiscal policy on this podcast and how they contribute to inflation. And there's also another piece of our economic puzzle that's going to be contributing to inflation, and that's our supply chains. And we're dealing with a huge impact on demand from COVID, and a lot of companies, a lot of industries out there readjusted their supply and their industrial capacity downwards, and as a result of reduced supply, reduced capacity, and an oncoming demand increase due to reopenings, I think that will exacerbate inflation on top of all the monetary and fiscal stimulus that we've seen in our economy.
So just one quick clarifying on what you're saying there is, so during the pandemic, there are a lot of different products that some things people bought more of, and there are problems in supply chains producing more of, like toilet paper, and there's other items that people are buying much less of, that companies then had overproduced and had inventory that they couldn't move, and so they stopped their production of certain products that weren't being purchased during the pandemic. And now when we reopen, those supply chains aren't going to be ready to produce at the level of demand that's going to come back online.
Correct. So let me start with a pretty simple industry.
Wait, Rogo, before you get into that, I want to ask you a question. This is something that I think we covered on maybe an episode a while ago, but if not, I kind of want to present a concept, which is, so a lot of people, look at the CPI data that comes out, which we just got our print today, which was actually hotter than expected. I don't know if we'll get to that. I don't know if you guys followed that or whatever, but I don't really even follow the CPI very closely because I think it's a bunch of nonsense. But that everyone hangs up on the CPI number, and during COVID it was like basically nothing, or it was like 0.3 whatever % inflation. It's like, but there's this concept of inflation versus deflation. When you have a deflationary shock like the coronavirus, you'd expect to see a massive number of negative inflation. But we never saw that whilst we had massive money printing. So there's a kind of school of thought that even though you don't see inflation in the number, like people say, oh, there's no inflation, it's 0%. It's like, well, what otherwise would have been deflation from a deflationary shock was papered over with artificial demand, with stimulus checks, with quantitative easing, infinity. It's like, so that print, that zero print, was actually a papered over massive negative print. With all this money printing, we printed 0% inflation. So that says, what otherwise would it have been? Would it have been negative 10%? From an actual deflationary shock. Do you kind of have any kind of thought on that, or is that something that you believe, or do you hang up on the CPI number?
Yeah, I think the CPI it gives you a directional estimate, but you guys, I think you've touched on this in previous podcasts. It's missing fuel and food.
Yeah.
What percent of your income goes to that?
Right.
So that's those are important details, but yeah, it's a good question. What are the to your point? What are the components of inflation, and what's driving that number? If we stripped out monetary policy, what would that number have been?
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to have a good answer on that. All we could really tell is after the fact, but you'd have to crunch the numbers and kind of separate that out.
Right. Yeah, and that's actually exactly the point, because it's like people want to say, like what I'm saying, like, oh, otherwise would have been this or that. It's like, well, you'll never know. Like that's economics. Like you'll never know. You can't do a controlled study with like CPI on the scale of a country. Like it's just like there's no. It's just so interesting that people like they mark every tick on the CPI. Oh, this was due to that. This was due to that. It's like, no, you don't know. Nothing is able to be determined from, a series of controlled experiments that'll lead to, the correlations that can actually imply causation. So, sorry to cut you off. You were going to go into like a specific sector of supply chain.
Yeah. Well, let's just go into travel, for example. So I'll dive into 3 areas. You got rental cars, you got air travel, and then you have Ubers. So let me start with rental cars. Hertz and most rental cars companies shed hundreds and thousands of vehicles from their fleet. No one was using them, and that was their way to generate cash during a downturn when their demand declined by 90%. Not easy to get those cars back when demand is up 50%. They prepared for a 90% demand increase. So
Right.
if you guys have been reading about it in the news, rental prices are through the roof for people traveling. So that just brings up my point. We had a big demand shock, and for those industries that adjusted their supply accordingly, we are going to see big price increases as a result. And bringing that capacity back online is going to be a challenge.
Do you think? Sorry, I was gonna say. Do you think like if a company like Hertz wasn't so deeply in debt, they wouldn't be so strapped for cash and wouldn't have needed to shed so much of their inventory in this recession? Like, would you say like that's going to be a contributing factor to the demand shock? Like, I can imagine, let's say every company's flush with cash, then you have a huge demand shock and they can just kind of weather it out because they don't really need the cash immediately.
Hertz doesn't need cash because they just filed for bankruptcy and their stock goes to the moon. So,
But Jeff, that's a fair question. So you could drive that 2 ways. You have your monetary policy where you're just pumping money into the economy, and it's easy to take up debt. But if we look at what happened to the banking industry in 2008, our solution to that was to regulate them. You have to have this amount of working capital. You have to have this amount of reserves for a rainy day. No other industry has that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think coming out of such a huge demand shock, there might become questions about that, and we haven't seen that so far, which, depending on your point of view, might be positive or negative. We could discuss that, but that's an alternative solution to regulate how much debt you can take on and how much capital you have for a rainy day.
I'll speak anecdotally, specifically on transportation. I've taken, I think, 2 rental cars in the past like 3 months, and both of them were just, one of them was way overpriced, and it was kind of a normal experience. The other one was a little overpriced, but just a terrible experience. I was like, they were understaffed. I like had to wait in line to both get the keys to the car and to drop off the keys, which I've never had to do. It was just like, so that might show up as the price didn't change for that specific company, but now they're staffed like maybe 1/3 of what they have. And so I just had a terrible experience with it. So that won't show up in the number, but
that's another thing that companies do, right? Is like, there's this kind of thing behavioral economists have seen, which is that prices are sticky, meaning that like consumers and employers and everyone tends to resist price changes. But one thing you can do is essentially reduce the quality and keep the price the same, and that's just a different way of raising the price. So like you just said, your experience was far worse, and that may not show up in like a CPI measure of inflation, but at its heart, essentially your purchasing power was reduced because you got a much worse experience for the same price.
So Rogo, going back to your example on renting these cars, so what you're saying is, Hertz Rent-A-Car, it doesn't have enough demand during the pandemic for their car rentals, so they offload a bunch of their cars. They sell a bunch to get immediate cash. Now, as people are coming back and want to rent cars again for travel, the supply is now short, the demand is now jumping back, and so they are able to charge a much higher price for their rental cars. Why can't that process then reverse itself in the future and adjust such that Hertz is now making a higher profit on their car rentals that they raise their prices on, and thus they have additional capital that they're then willing to spend on the repurchasing of cars to increase their supply to meet the demand, and then rebalance the pricing? Would that not suggest a scenario in which it's just a temporary spike in pricing due to a lack of supply matching the demand that can then be a reversal of that same process?
Yeah. So it's not, I don't want to say it's easier to shed assets than it is to gain assets, but there is a lead time to build back your fleet. Mm-hmm. So whatever that lead time is to get back to 50%, 80%, 100% of what their previous fleet was, whatever the discrepancy, so they get back to 50% of their fleet. It takes them 2-3 months to get back to 50% of their fleet, but demand is 80% of what it used to be. That 30% gap, it makes a big difference. So it depends on the lead time, Dale, to your question. Mm-hmm. And that might be months, that might be years. It depends on the industry and what you're buying. And so in that gap, so we might be seeing for certain goods 6 months of big price increases, or we might be seeing 2 years of big price increases. It depends on how expensive it is to build those assets.
I would add, also at that point, that company that's in flux is kind of at the hands of the bid-ask spread. So the car market isn't super liquid. So when they're selling at the ask, and when they're buying at the bid. So they're kind of however illiquid the car market, which during the pandemic, I might be thinking of something else, but regardless of that, whatever you sell it at, you're going to buy back at a higher price to try to get the same kind of quality. It's just the way the market works.
And Jeff, we were talking about how you have 0 beers in your house earlier. If you're at the supermarket, there's 5 beers, and there are 10 people that want those beers. The price is going to be a lot different than if there's only 5 people that want those beers. So having a seller's market versus a buyer's market, what we're seeing here is in a lot of industries it's a seller's market as a result of not having the capacity to meet demand.
And irresponsible on Jeff's part for not keeping inventory stocked when it comes to beers.
I mean, when you guys said we were going to be talking about inflation, I thought we were going to be talking about inflation of UFO sightings. So, I mean, my notes are fucking useless.
Which have inflated during the pandemic. I just saw an article on that. I think
So, I don't know.
people are
I'm ill prepared across every aspect.
Yeah.
So I'll touch on air travel and Ubers. Air travel quickly, and then we'll go into Ubers. Air travel is also an asset-intensive business. That hasn't come back as quickly, but buying airplanes is going to take time, and a lot of those companies, I mean, people are going to want to travel now. We just talked about rental cars, and airplanes have a even longer lead time. So it hasn't happened yet, or it hasn't happened to a great degree yet, but I see airfares going up big time. And then there's assets that are pretty cheap to gain. So if you think about Ubers, Ubers are just people in cars, and really it's just people. You just need to be recruiting people to be driving on the road with the cars that they already own. And what we're seeing is that there's not enough supply of Uber drivers to meet the new demands.
Also anecdotally, the past couple of Ubers I tried to take were just like, I would like check the price and then I didn't get it, and I checked the price 10 minutes later and it was double. This was after landing in an airplane, so I guess everyone's checking the price at the same time, and I just like watched it double in front of my eyes. I actually took a taxi. I haven't taken a taxi in 5 years. And I was like, the taxi was cheaper than the Uber, which like hasn't been the case in a long time. Sorry to cut you off.
Yeah, I was in Boston, and I literally could not find a single Uber the whole time I was there.
Yeah.
It was crazy.
Well, that's because you were looking for an Uber. There you got to find an Uber.
Uber. Yeah. And it seems, I think with the pandemic, that's also not just a pricing problem, but I think people are also like less willing to have strangers get in their cars.
Yeah,
that's true.
During the pandemic. Yeah. But Rogo, your airline example seems like it's it's like a parallel example to the rental car example, but I think it's a little bit less intuitive to me because I don't understand who would be a buyer of commercial airplanes. I would imagine only other commercial airlines who are competitors would be buyers of commercial airplanes. So who do they offload airplanes to?
Yeah, good question. So when, let's say Delta, they don't need as many narrow bodies to be flying domestically from Atlanta to whatever destination there is. So what they'll do is they'll first get rid of their more expensive, the older aircraft in their fleet that are more expensive to maintain. So 737s built in the 90s, for example.
Get rid of them how?
So they'll just stop flying them. So they'll go to a graveyard, usually in a dry climate like Arizona, and they'll just strip them down and sell the aircraft off for parts. So they'll try to find a buyer, but in a depressed market, you won't, and you'll strip it down for parts. And when a newer aircraft needs those parts, they're available in the aftermarket.
Now,
go ahead. If I could add something, I feel like some people might be thinking, oh, why don't they just stow them away for later use? Well, it's because that has a cost to it, and like storing it at a graveyard where it doesn't need to come back in great condition to be flown again is much cheaper. You can basically just offload the thing for no cost to you versus if you wanted to actually store it somewhere, you'd have to make sure it's in like in controlled environment that's it's not taking damage, all that stuff, if you want to pull it back out for use again. And like the real estate for something like that would probably be pretty expensive. I don't know much about the airplane market, but generally storing assets has like physical assets has significant cost, and if the demand's just not there and they don't have the cash flow, they can't afford to do that.
So even just getting rid of it at a zero revenue is still reducing your costs substantially enough that it could be beneficial.
Right.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So, I mean, they're shedding assets from their fleet, but they're going to have to bring back new assets. They're going to have to buy it from Boeing, Airbus in the future to replace those assets. They don't have those orders on their books now. So, usually in asset-intensive industries, the boom and bust times are usually more cyclical. So during good times, they're really enjoying record profits, and then in down times, they swing to huge losses. And being an airline, being an aircraft manufacturer, is certainly two of those industries.
Now, with airlines specifically, I know that was a sector that was specifically targeted by the PPP program and like the CARES Act. So do you think, I don't know if you can speak, like to what actually happened or the actual logistics of that, because I don't know. I know certain money from the PPP was earmarked, like this money will go to the airlines that maintain 75% of their staff or whatever it was until like whatever date, October 1st. I don't know the specifics, but I do know that there was money into that sector specifically. Now, do you think that money actually kind of redirected the logistics of that the plane going to the graveyard process, or does that money stop that, or do they continue the same process and just pocket the money that would other? Because I don't think money was actually earmarked for maintaining inventory, but I can imagine that if I was an airline and I didn't have any demand and I was getting money pumped into my company, I would just continue to deplane my fleet and then just pocket the money that I was, because I can use that money later to buy new planes, for example, if I do need them.
Yeah. My impression was that money all goes towards paying the salaries and the benefits of their employees as opposed to furloughing them. So I don't think they certainly benefit in that they don't have to fire or sever as many people. But I don't think that impacts the asset decisions because they're going to be incurring huge costs just from letting them sit idle, regardless of the decisions on the people side. But we could talk a little bit about the ramifications of protecting the airline industry versus, for example, something like Uber. So the government discouraged airline travel. So the logic there was to pay for the workers impacted. The government would pay for workers impacted. So they're going to have less cost in trying to hire back their employees. Uber just, I think a week or two ago, announced that they have to spend $250 million to hire back or to incentivize drivers to get back on the roads.
That's crazy.
So right now, Jeff, you might have paid a $60 Uber versus a $30 Uber, and Uber might be pocketing all that, or the drivers might be pocketing all that, but Uber's costs are going to go up with all the recruiting expenses, they have to increase the wages of their drivers. So it's not just padding inflation doesn't just pad the profit margins of the producers. It also impacts, it also increases their cost base. And you could see that in increased hiring cost and increased cost of building your assets back up.
Yeah, it seems to me though that with sufficient sort of rainy day fund kind of capital, if people actually had that sitting around, you could avoid a lot of these issues. And it seems like there's just dead weight loss by all of this, right? Because it's like you said, if you're sending planes to a graveyard and then building new ones, that's just dead weight loss, right? Like you're getting rid of planes that could have been still flying in the air and then building entire new ones to replace them. And, et cetera, with Uber, like people are quitting, and then now you have to incentivize them just to come back. It's like, well, if that had just continued on at steady state or whatever, just had a divot, but the divot was just minor, then, you'd avoid a lot of these costs. But I think the fact that there's like this deadweight loss here, then prices just go up and quantity does not. So we just ultimately have that inflation from the supply shock in that sense.
Yeah, I think what we're kind of circling around is one issue that Rogo was kind of touching on, was the fact that certain industries like the airline industry have these huge fluctuations in really highly profitable periods and then high loss periods when demand falls. And what they're not doing, which is kind of something that was we talked about earlier, was addressed during the banking crisis, is once we realized these banks weren't keeping the necessary working capital on hand, and that thus they couldn't cover their losses and deficits when the market really turned sour. Similarly, the airline industry is going to have hugely profitable years, but they're not going to set aside a war chest of cash for potential down year, negative cash flow years in the future. So when a huge pandemic hits, and we're deciding to subsidize that industry with government funding, yes, there's some obvious benefits to the consumer in that, airline prices didn't significantly spike as a result of the reduction in supply of flights. Yet we have to question what kind of incentive structure we're creating for these big airline businesses, such that we're telling them, if the market really crashes for you, we want American citizens to still be able to fly at a reasonable price. So, yeah, you didn't put enough working capital on hand over the last 10 years of profit, but that's okay. We'll bail you out. We'll give you some cash to keep your employees hired.
Moral hazard.
So, yeah, to me, there's no question.
I think
that's moral hazard right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the solution that we implemented in the banking crisis was to regulate these banks and require them to keep a certain amount of capital on hand. But I'm sure you guys wouldn't suggest that regulating the airline industries to do the same thing is the solution.
Well, what I would say is they've been incentivized beforehand to act the way they're acting. They anticipated probably bailouts. They anticipated lower interest rates to allow them to borrow to rebuild their assets. They anticipated all these things, and so they didn't set aside capital because they didn't fear bankruptcy. Exactly. Boeing was like, oh, we're at risk of bankruptcy, but they didn't fear it because they knew they would get helped out. And so, the moral hazard is not, it doesn't occur when you observe it. It occurs beforehand, right? When people are essentially operating improperly according to incentives you added into the system. And so obviously we can't go back and fix that, but just doubling down and saying, well, we're already here and we can't let Boeing fail, I don't know. To me, that hole is only going to get dug deeper. I don't see that as a viable solution to just keep doubling down on these policies.
Yeah, so maybe the solution was the bailouts to certain industries or causes moral hazards. But what would you say to those workers that would lose their jobs during the bankruptcy process and just this any sort of demand shock that we could foresee in the future?
I would say in the long run, they'd probably, there's always winners and losers, right? And so whenever you do a bailout, you're just essentially socializing costs, but it's it's not perfectly efficient, right? So whatever cost those workers are bearing because of a demand shock or what have you, obviously COVID's no one's fault except maybe some lab in Wuhan, but it's difficult when you can't foresee these things and it's nobody's fault, right? But a lot of things are nobody's fault, and so I don't think that's even relevant to talk about. But if you just socialize these costs, you're not going to have perfectly efficient transfer of the cost borne by these people gets translated to all these people, nor should you even really want that, because if we just start socializing all the costs that every individual is going to bear, then people aren't going to retrain themselves if they need to. Like sometimes, like the airline industry is probably not going anywhere. It's probably not changing in a big way as a result of COVID. But you know, if the film industry with like Kodak cameras went away, and you're, I don't know, a film developer or whatever, I don't totally know what is in that industry, but like certain jobs need to go away, and you need to retrain yourself to do something else. And if you're incentivizing people not to do that, it's ultimately we're all just going to lose.
Yeah, that's a good point. I could see someone countering with, oh, that's insensitive. Like, people lost a job due to something outside of their control. And in normal times, in a healthy economy, if you're in a structurally declining industry or structurally declining company, you could find something that's structurally increasing or retrain yourself. But when everyone's dealing with misfortune, it's a little more challenging. And
right.
I would tend to agree with you more on the side of, hey, let's do less and maybe protect the American worker a little less to prevent the moral hazard issues. But that's probably there's certainly a counter argument to that not there's a substantial portion of the population that might disagree.
Right. Well, let me add like another aspect of it, right? So, like you said, there's a demand shock, and people aren't traveling. They're not driving Ubers. They're not doing all these things. But now suddenly there's a ton more pressure on other industries to produce more. I don't know, more deliveries, more whatever, what have you. Those people need to reallocate to those other industries. And if you socialize the costs by essentially reducing the profits in other industries to bail out these industries that are less needed, then you're slowing the progress of people being able to adapt to the changing demands of the society, right? So it's just making all of us worse off in general. Even though like you're helping a few people, you know, a few people are going to be better off. I would say there's on net, you're destroying more, you know, well-being for more people.
Yeah. So I think just to put that into like a really simple example. So let's say like, you know, obviously like demand for hard paper newspapers has gone down significantly, but does have some social good for like spreading knowledge, right? If demand for newspapers goes down significantly, that doesn't mean that we should like subsidize, you know, the New York Times and the Washington Post to continue operating people to work at their printing plant so that a bunch of stacks of newspapers can like sit idle in an inventory somewhere unread. But rather we should allow those businesses.
Newspaper printer go burr.
So you should allow those businesses and employees to. So one option is allowing those businesses and employees to, you know, maybe go bankrupt or struggle or lay off people, and then, you know, they're going to have some seriously negative effects, at least temporarily. They're going to be forced to go find some industry that has some demand in some new, you know, employment. But at a minimum, one perhaps better solution is rather than, you know, bail out the airlines to say like, hey, keep everything status quo. We need these big airlines, would be potentially to instead divert that money to like retraining of employees or like some temporary like unemployment benefits or something that goes directly to the individual who then needs to, you know, reallocate their labor, as opposed to the big businesses keeping their employees whether or not they need them.
Yeah.
So I want to answer that. I want to answer the question too. So what would you say to that person, or to the people that are kind of shit out of luck during the pandemic, and you say no, we can't subsidize your industry. You're going to be without a job. What I would say to them would be, it's like, all right, so you're down on your luck, which is, it's actually not your fault, you know, and it happens, and I feel bad, you know, I want to help you, or you need help, essentially. It's like, so who do you want to help you, right? You have two options. The first option is the people who have won the popularity contest and have a money printer, right? That's their at their disposal. The other group that could help you is the people that were prepared for the pandemic, right? They had savings. Their company was able to innovate and get around it, and it's a healthy sector through time of turmoil, right? So it's like, who do you want to help you? It's like, well, that one group sounds like I want to go work in that industry, right? So the thing with the airplanes, for example, or like the airplane sector, is like those assets were all bad. Like those companies were all bad. They had no operating, or they had no cash reserves to come in and pay their staff while no operations are taking place, right? They have to. And what happens if they declare bankruptcy, right? They have to lay everyone off and then liquidate all their assets. Well, who buys all their assets? And like we said on this podcast, the airplane industry is not going away. So the person that steps in and buys up the assets, hires the people in that sector, is the person who was prepared, for some reason was prepared, either through luck or had a good idea of what risks there are in life. You have to have a rainy day fund, essentially. So who do you want that person to step in? And what happened was the person with the money printer and who won the popularity contest stepped in and said, "I got this, guys," and took away the choice, right? And it seems like that person is like good or benevolent, but it's like we don't really see it, like what we're talking about. That's the real cost. Like that person who was ready to swoop in and save the day. I mean, albeit they're going to make a lot of money in it. It's not like they're doing it. It's not like charity. They're doing business. And honestly, the best way to help someone sometimes is to give them a job and to give them that self-worth and that value. So it's like that person who was ready to come in and actually save the day was told to, just go away. Like we got this, kind of, we're going to print a bunch of money and everything's going to be fine. So it's like, that's what happened. It wasn't explicit, and to that person never got the choice, and it wasn't portrayed that way to them. But that's.
And just to clarify, what you're saying is like businesses that had cash on hand or continued to be profitable or were more conservative in their like spending may have been prepared to hire people and to take off some of that labor force, whereas certain businesses that didn't keep that cash on hand instead were just bailed out, despite the fact that they made poor business decisions leading up to a crisis.
Right.
Yeah. And what we're describing here is what has caused the great moderation over the last 30 years. You have these boom and bust times that are just completely moderated by fiscal support and monetary support. There's excess cash, and the government's willing to step in when your industry is going bust because they don't want anyone to be laid off. So that's causing our 2% GDP growth versus seeing spikes of 6%, 6%, and then going back to -2 or something like that.
Yeah.
It's like if you're in a classroom and you're about to take a math test and the teacher says, okay, you can choose a partner, or you can choose someone's paper to cheat off of, and it's allowed for some reason. And it's like everyone starts looking around the room looking for the person who's the best at math, and they're getting ready to go ask them. And then the most popular guy in the corner says, guys, I got this. No one needs to make a decision. Everyone can copy off of me. And the teacher says, okay, since you spoke first, everyone gets to cheat off of him. And then everyone's just like, all right. I mean, I'd rather cheat off of someone than no one. But the guy who's actually good at math over in the corner is like, all right, well, good luck.
Yeah, I think the one government support that is generally good in downtimes is you have a bunch of people but when the economy's healthy, everyone's presumably working in a healthy productive fashion. When there's a huge demand shock, like when we saw in COVID, you have all this excess capacity, specifically in labor. And the government just swooped in and said, hey, we'll pay for your labor now. Right. But a productive capacity for those workers might have been on the infrastructure bill that we're talking about now. Right. Perhaps working on filling potholes or building airports, something that everyone uses. That's a shared function that no one in industry is really... It's hard to build a business case. That's the function of that's supposed to be the function of government, redeploying those workers to something productive and the government has a mandate to do.
Just to play devil's advocate, though, didn't we kind of start this podcast by saying that demand is going to spike back for things like the airline industry, and thus we're going to need those same employees that we had earlier?
Yes.
And
but,
so the government's kind of bridging that gap.
Yeah, just bridging the gap in the interim. I guess maybe I'll double back and say I wouldn't want a half-built bridge.
Yeah.
That is sort of a danger, right?
The stipulation I would add, it's like, yeah, do all your public projects, but you just got to have a real market of lending. Like if you had real interest rates, then it's like, yeah, go ahead, start your public works project and see what happens to interest rates. Like, does that bridge actually facilitate productive capacity in your society? And it's like, then you'll have no problem. That lending is going to get paid off in tax receipts over the next 20, 30 years. But when you have an artificial market for lending, then your public works projects is just like everyone's patting each other on the back. Like, look at all the bridges we built. And they're just like no one uses them. And then
Right.
It's like, good job. We paid off all our bonds and we built the bridge. It's just like,
Yeah.
it's just like
I think another thing.
Yeah.
Another thing I wanted to bring up though is we were talking about how like there's costs of reallocating labor, right? Not just capital. And another huge problem I see there is I think the cost of hiring these days has gone up tremendously since, let's say, maybe the 1950s for comparison. And that causes so much friction in reallocating labor that there's just going to be a ton of deadweight loss when you have demand shocks, because you've built in inherent costs to acquiring people. So anytime there is a big restructuring, you're just increasing the amount of deadweight loss that you're going to experience as a result. Like, for example, just, there's many worker protections now, like there's a lot of liability in hiring someone. And so employers really just don't want to hire people unless they absolutely have to. And they want to do like a lot of research before they hire someone, because the cost of firing them is so great that it's just, there's this ton of friction baked into the labor market that I would say didn't used to exist maybe 70 years ago.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So what's kind of Rogo, what's your overarching theme of what is the kind of impending potential problem when it comes to these logistics in general? So you're saying in general a lot of these certain businesses that had demand shocks during the pandemic offloaded a lot of inventory, and now that demand's going to come back and thus prices are going to spike. But there's potential that that's just temporary, and then they'll buy back or rebuild inventory, and things could rebalance potentially, but we don't know how long that's going to take. Is that kind of the overarching theme, or is there something that might be more of a long-term effect that you could see playing out?
Yeah, that's the general thesis. And what I'll caution, and this is just Rogo's belief, but the Fed's just saying, oh, we're praying, we're going to keep printing until we hit that 2%. And that's not going to be the reality. We're going to go way above that 2%. And that's partially due to money supply, monetary supply, fiscal support, just pumping in more money.
You're saying 2% growth?
Inflation.
2% inflation. But we're also seeing on the supply side that companies shed assets due to COVID, and they're not going to build them back in time, and as a result they're just going to charge higher prices because demand stayed the same and their capacity is reduced. So what I'm cautioning is inflation is going to be higher than what they're saying, and that it might last for a little longer. So it might last 1 to 2 years of 3 to 5% price increases versus what they're saying of, it might be a little above 2% for a year when they're building back up capacity. I think we're going to go through a little bit of a longer inflation period than what you might hear in the media.
So,
And go ahead,
Yeah.
Jeff. I was just going to ask you if you think there's like winners and losers to that, like these specific industries we're talking about are going to have those huge price spikes where others may just stay steady, or do you think that's going to?
Yeah, it's going to be industry dependent, and I have more examples, and I don't know if we'll have time to talk through those, but
I think the concept's laid out well, though.
Yeah.
Now, so on to talk about essentially not necessarily solutions, maybe a little bit of solutions, but a little bit of like, I guess how you can prepare yourself as well. But inflation concerns me, right? Obviously, like you have to get your savings in order to make sure that you have a little bit more than you thought you did, because you're going to take a hit to your purchasing power. But one thing that's really concerning to me is it seems like there's no political appetite to meet a serious inflation problem with what I would say is the necessary cure, which is one, let the market, recapitalize so that it can start meeting the new demand, and two, increasing interest rates so that the money supply comes down a little bit and inflation doesn't get out of hand. I don't see any political willpower for anything like that, and the thing that concerns me the most is we might see things like price controls. I feel like there's a lot of political vigor in that space, and that to me is like the single most devastating thing a country can do to its people is impose price controls in markets with high inflation.
Yeah, I would also agree. Just the potential solution, and what I might recommend would be tightening the monetary supply,
Mm-hmm.
and increasing rates, perhaps winding back or even buying back treasuries per the quantitative easing policy. But
do you think price controls are something
You meant
we're likely
selling
to see?
selling treasuries.
Correct. Yes, you're right.
Yeah.
I don't recommend price controls.
Right, but I don't think most people would. But do you think like we're in store for that? What do you think about that?
I think price controls are usually big on stuff that you see every day. So like food prices, rental prices, even gas prices. But I don't think we'll end up seeing that, and
Okay.
I don't think we'll be vigor, but for that. But there's going to be pockets of it, and I mean, you might see like a $800 flight from New York to Chicago, which is a pretty frequent lane, but I think it's I don't think we'll see price controls.
But aren't kind of all these things we're talking about, like subsidizing these industries, aren't these kind of like just backdoor price controls to a lot of these industries?
Yeah, but I think the backdoor price control is so much better
Yeah.
than the outright price control, because it's like pushing on a rope versus just cutting it in half. Like if you just
Right.
pump a little money in, yeah, like that'll bring the price down at a cost to society, and so in effect it is reducing the price. But when you just slap like a price control on it, you just essentially wipe out the supply,
Right.
which is so much more devastating.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like on its face, it's just so much more dastardly. Like it's like you said, pushing on a string versus cutting it. It's like, yeah, I'm gonna just like manipulate the price with my, with my manipulation, versus like you're gonna charge this price, or I'm gonna put you in a cage with a gun to your head. Like it's like that's a whole nother level of like talk about like corrupt mafia or like whatever. Like I was having this conversation the other day with someone, but Rogo, you mentioned the kind of inflation running hot for the next, what did you say, 3 to 5 years? Or no, you said 3 to 5% inflation for the next
Yeah,
Couple of
one
years.
to
demand
2
spike.
years.
So I
I
don't
would
know
say
if
2 years.
you spend time thinking about, or I don't. This is just the conversation I was having, but like, so with a demand spike that leads to price increases, uh, well, increases beget inflation expectations, right? Obviously, inflation, witnessed inflation leads to inflation expectations because people are going to say nothing's changing. Especially during like if there's a demand spike, there's going to be people are going to be like, all right, well, we're in this for a good bit. We must be. So the inflation expectations would tend to rise. When inflation expectations rise, then bond yields tend to rise. When bond yields tend to rise, the Fed, who has been setting the ceiling on bond yields by purchasing them through open market operations, financed through printing money. When they see bond yields rise, they buy more bonds. When they buy more bonds, they print more money, and when they print more money, people see that, and the inflation expectations increase. So there's like I don't think like I have a hard time seeing just like a inflation running hot for a little bit because like Jeff, you said, like there's no political appetite to deal with that. Like the measures for that are exactly what to cut down on that cycle are exactly what no politician wants to do. It's basically putting your head underneath a guillotine, right? To say, oh, by the way, I'm gonna tighten monetary policy by 25 basis points, and then watch the next day this S&P crashes 15%, and you'll see like
Right, you're standing there saying, "This is a healthy adjustment, I promise."
yeah, like there's just no appetite for like any kind of fiscal responsibility. So I could really see it getting out of hand, and the key aspect would be inflation expectations. Once that genie gets out of the bottle, if no one wants to reel that in, it's just going to run rampant, and you kind of lose it. Do you agree with
Well,
that at all? Or?
yeah, I think the market's already priced in some inflation expectations. The 10-year yield increased from, I forget what it was, 0.5% to 0.7%.
Right.
Now it's 1.7, and that happened in 3-4 months. It was a very rapid increase. Still very low yield, 1.7%. I don't know if that's healthy long term, but my message is it still has room. I think it's still likely to go up. Inflation expectations aren't high enough, and then we'll see the yields move, and then we'll see if the Fed reacts. I think, to your point, I'm skeptical that it will. They're going to want to protect the American worker. They're going to want to protect investors over prices. And that's been the case for 30, 40 years, and it'll be fascinating to see where we land 2 years from now, whether the mindset shifts. But to your point, nothing indicates that it will.
Well, what will determine Fed policy is if I own calls or puts on the S&P, because whichever one I own, they'll do the opposite. It's actually up to me.
Oh,
They're
God.
watching you, Jeff, flow through you.
Powell's got a phone on his desk that's got a direct line to your brokerage account. It's like, what the heck? Jeff just put in 2 calls. He's like, Titan.
How do I short Jeff?
My only question is why we always have all you nerd-ass engineers from Penn on here talking about inflation and the macroeconomics instead of all the Wharton guys.
Because engineers are smart.
They're not in here talking.
Well, the Wharton guys they're making money because they got all the stocks. They're incentivized not to think about this stuff.
You're right.
Yeah, I think.
Right.
I mean, certain people just don't think too deep into what they're looking at. So you have
if
a
you're
lot
getting
of
paid enough, you don't need to.
I think the good finance guys, the good Warren guys, are thinking about this. But
Not
then there's some people, the average person doesn't really care about the details. And what's refreshing listening to you guys is you care about diving deep. It doesn't matter your background, but you're willing to learn, to ask questions and learn more about what's driving our monetary policy, as opposed to just being handed a spreadsheet and saying, "Oh, go find the valuation."
Thanks, brother.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it.
No, it's good. You guys.
You said you had
stuff.
a gotcha question for us, though.
Yeah.
Do you still have that question ready?
I have my gotcha question. So.
I'm ready.
So I think, Jeff, you talked earlier about the huge cost of hiring employees, and because you have to protect your employees. Severing employees is expensive, but let's talk about the cost of retaining employees. And what was so I'll get into retention in a moment, but my gotcha question is, what was wage growth in 2020?
I mean, I don't know.
Is estimate?
Did I fail?
Yeah, give me a sec. I'll say
know.
like a good estimate would be between -10 and 10. What's the number for wage growth?
In 2020, you said?
Yeah.
I'll say
I would say 0.
I'll say
I'm gonna say +5.
+2.
Okay.
And the winner is Dale. It was 5.1%.
Wow, nailed it too.
So you think about it. We just had the biggest demand shock. We laid off 30 million employees, and our wages increased. When I saw a statistic, I'm like, how the hell did that happen?
What does it mean, Rogo?
So you think about it. Your average retail employee, so Target, Walmart, they have to brave, and at your distribution centers, fulfilling all the e-commerce demand. They have to go into work and have someone cough on them. So all these places, so your rank and file hourly worker had to brave COVID conditions, and employers tried to keep them. So they their wages increased due to all these retention bonuses and increased compensation to make sure that they keep working.
Coughing bonuses.
Coughing bonus. Also, something that made me realize is their incentives not to work also went up, which means you would have to pay them more just to keep them, because they have a higher incentive not to work.
Yeah, I keep hearing about that. Trying to hire minimum wage employees is just impossible, because it's like, who in their right mind would give up free money for marginally more money when having to do shit work?
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to fill your time with bullshit at home these days.
Yeah.
Just find me and Jeff hung over on a Sunday, and you can find a pretty easy way to kill a full day at a time.
It involves pork rinds.
Yeah, but that was the interesting statistic.
That is interesting.
Yeah, that is
5% wage increase, while GDP only went down 3.5% in the U.S. It was much higher in Europe and some oil-dependent countries like Russia or Brazil, but U.S. is only minus 3.5%, and the projections are for it to grow 5 to 6% this year. But then you have countries, I forget, but I want to say Japan, that contracted 3 to 4% this year, and then are only projected to increase by 2% this year. So there are countries out there that aren't going to fully recover in 2021. And a lot of what I'm reading in the media is that, and this there's probably an element of truth here that our bounce back exceeds our decline last year as a result of these monetary and fiscal actions, just artificially creating demand, and then the demand comes, and that's creating the GDP growth. But those are interesting things to read in a report I recently read.
Here's an unrelated question, well, somewhat related. Are you like long run bullish on the United States? And if yes or no, how does that compare in relation to, let's say, other major powers like the Eurozone, Russia, China, stuff like that?
You're saying stocks in the stock market? The US stock market?
No, not stocks. Just like as
global
being
power rankings.
No, just like as being a good place to do business. Like right now, the U.S. developed many of the vaccines. There's still a ton of innovation here. We're still pretty much an economic powerhouse in many ways. And I wonder, do you see the U.S.'s economic essentially power in a sense of innovation, productivity, growth, all those sorts of things? Are you long-term bullish or bearish on that for the U.S.? And how does that compare to, like, I guess, other countries, if you think like they're doing things better or not worse than us? Yeah, or do you not think about that?
No, I'm still long-term bullish on the U.S. But I mean, especially compared to Europe, I think Europe has struggled as a result of the pandemic, and I think the U.S. will relatively outperform them. But you have your developing nations that are going to see greater growth, and likely the ones with that have their governments that have their act together will see greater growth. And I'm not good at picking winners and losers in terms of stable governments, but long term, I think the U.S. will be good. But you compare that. I always say 20, 30 years, the U.S. That's a good investment horizon. But if you tell me 100 years, you guys have. I always see a monetary a crash of the U.S. dollar, and I think you guys have covered all that. I wouldn't invest for a 100-year time horizon, but you might somewhere between 50 and 100% safe that. I would bet on heads, and heads might come up that we'll be safe in 20 to 30 years.
Interesting.
What are your guys' thoughts?
Well, before we go, I just want to. I don't know if that's just kind of you, kind of zooming out and saying, just on like a long enough time scale, you don't really see such drastic things happening so fast in our kind of early careers, or is there something specific you see not happening for like a 20, 30, 50 years out? Like, what's different about 50 years as opposed to 20 years in your mind to make that distinction?
I think like one of the measures I look at is our interest payments as a percent of tax revenues, and I don't think that's in a dangerous spot yet, but it will be, and I think that might take 20 to 30 years to manifest. We always look at GDP as a percent of
debt as a percentage of GDP.
Yeah, and it's over 100% now.
Yeah, it's like 120.
Yeah,
but it's what's a more relevant ratio is the ratio of GDP to interest.
You have GDP at so 100%. So we take 20% of that as taxes, and then our interest rates are at, let's call it 3 to 4% on treasuries. That's very conservative.
3 to 4% on a 30-year. A 30-year is still under 2%, right?
All right, we'll use whatever number. So 2% is our 30-year.
Yeah.
And you take 2% of 120. We can make our interest payments for a while. So I think it's 20, 30 years until we're coming close to being maybe getting dangerous on our interest payments. So that's why I say that.
Okay, that's
Right.
a good
So
answer.
I think that's the trigger versus looking at debt to GDP.
Right.
I think that's a fair analysis. I agree that the relevant metric is tax revenue compared to interest expense, just like almost like a bean counting accounting exercise. But here's where I think there's a monkey in that
Monkey wrench.
What's the monkey wrench in that in that situation is most of our debt is in 1 to 2 year bonds that we just continuously roll. So essentially the interest rate on our debt is adjustable rate in a sense because it's mostly 1 to 2 year maturity.
And we always just roll them over.
Yeah, we just roll it over, right? So if we ever did see a spike in interest rates, I think that could rapidly collapse the entire system. And so I don't know what it would take to do that, because if COVID plus $7 trillion worth of money printing can't really budge interest rates to a significant degree so far, like to me, like if you had asked me that was going to happen in 2019, if you told me 2020, we're going to have 30% reduction in GDP and we're going to print $7 trillion to make up for it, and you asked me, how are long-term interest rates affected? I would say they would be at like 10% or something,
right.
And they're not. So, I tend to overestimate, I think, how that will impact long-term interest rates. But, there's always that possibility that they could go up. I don't know why. I don't know what would cause it at this point, because this seemed like a pretty devastating event. But I just think we're in such a precarious position. That's why I'm sort of bearish on the U.S. government or just the current system. Like, I feel like some sort of restructuring is due, I think, in our lifetime.
Yeah, we could be like Russia and just default.
Right.
In 1998.
Right. But that, that's not without its consequences, obviously.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm right there too. Like I appreciate that answer, because that is the calculation that needs to happen. What for our government to be solvent, handling those interest payments, which is such a large percentage of our net expense, offset by tax receipts. You can kind of play that game and see what it looks like in steady state. I just agree with Jeff. I think that within the 20, 30 year time horizon, there are so many destabilizing forces that could throw it out of steady state that now it's just like a whole new ballgame. Either interest rates at 10%, now interest is whatever 10 times what it was before, or inflation is running crazy hot, and so interest rates are still low, but the government has to have 10 times the expenditure on public spending. So it's just, there's so many things and that's just what I was trying to explain before with like that vicious cycle. It's just like whatever the Fed tries to do to like plug one hole, just like 10 more are gonna like spring open. So I just see so much destabilization potential. So I think I'm within the 20-30 year to see that kind of dollar collapse.
To you more bearish guys, does it make you more comfortable knowing that like a large portion of our government's debt is held by U.S. citizens?
Less comfortable.
No, I think that's less. Yeah, I'm less comfortable with that.
Why is that?
Because like the default scenario,
they live closer to me.
in the case of a default.
In a default scenario, that's our parents and grandparents holding those assets, and they're getting told you're not getting paid anything.
Like their pensions.
So they're out homeless. It's like, wow, we're gonna put our parents out homeless, or we're gonna send our kids into crippling debt. Like it's like, who pick your poison kind of thing.
Like, for better or worse, I'm pretty confident in our military to like defend us if we default on some debt and some other country has some anger with that. So I would actually, I don't know. It's not either way. It's people getting affected.
That's speaking though as right, but that's speaking as though the default scenario, defaulting on our debt is like the only likely outcome is kind of what you're
Well, like
suggesting.
the alternative is to inflate it away.
Yeah.
Which is worse in my opinion. I would rather we default on it.
I would
if we
actually,
have to.
I would say that some kind of military skirmish is more likely in the event that we don't default, that we continue what we're doing right now, is propping up our like assets at the risk of devaluing the dollar, because what's going to happen? So on the global stage, the dollar is very important. It's the world reserve currency, right? So if international transactions become a lot less efficient and the world goes into a global depression, there is a very if we just continue what we're doing right now, so there's no throw up our hands, oh, default, we can't do it anymore. Like, we just continue with our process of devaluation at an accelerated pace, the world can actually look to us and say, hey, you're screwing it up. Like, you're screwing up the whole system and they could call us currency manipulators, for example. It's like, people have gone to war for less, right? So currency manipulation is no joke, and that would actually be more of a means to that would actually be more of a reason to go to like a military, like I said, skirmish, than if we throw up our hands in default. It's like, well, we just saved the dollar essentially, and that's all the world cares about. We're not exporting anything.
Right.
All they want from us are green pieces of paper, and if we don't devaluate those, then it's like no one has a problem with that. It's just we are now screwed because none of our assets are worth anything because they're all paper assets.
You guys do, and the problem isn't only the U.S. It's everywhere. Europe, and if one of those folds before us, then we're still screwed because we have a ton of investors investing in India, China, wherever, with all these absurd leverage and monetary stimulus.
I'd like to pick your brain on Bitcoin, just because we got into the topic of, fiat destabilization and stuff like that. And mostly I just want us to be able to put it in the title so that our views go up.
Yeah.
But I'd also like to
we brought on Rogo to talk about Bitcoin and some other stuff.
Right. So what do you think of Bitcoin?
Yeah, what's your question?
Bullish, bearish on
Bitcoin? Bitcoin specifically, or
just I don't know what okay, let me phrase it this way.
More general.
Do you view cryptocurrencies as a potential alternative to the current monetary system of like fiat currency? Do you have are you bullish on the price target of Bitcoin, anything like that?
So
essentially,
the CEO of Coinbase, I watched his interview on CNBC one day. He's like, stop telling me what Bitcoin is in terms of dollars. Tell me how much it is in terms of Maseratis. How many Maseratis can I get with my Bitcoin? So until we get to that point, we keep comparing it to the dollar. And people say, I think if we just use it as a store of value, it could be great. Mm-hmm. But if we're comparing it to, if we're using our dollars as a store of value, and I don't see demand for Bitcoin diminishing. I think it's going to continue to get greater acceptance. So the price might, in the long term, increase, but that doesn't make it a good store of value. We want something pretty stable for that. So I don't think the dollar's function as a store of value is going to decrease in the near term, but I do see Bitcoin's potential value going up. And that's because it's benchmarked against the dollar, and so that's just my point of view. Not that I'm investing in Bitcoin or recommending that you invest in Bitcoin, but I don't think it's a good replacement yet.
Twitter just keeps recommending people to me that
say
nothing but with laser eyes. Like, my whole feed is like Star Wars at this point, of just or like Superman with heat vision, and it's just like, whatever you do, don't buy real estate or food or shelter, or just like they're like only buy Bitcoin. That's all I ever see people saying, like buy nothing else.
Yeah. I mean, it's like CrossFit. There's the people that talk a lot about Bitcoin are only bullish on it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, let's change that because I have a lot to say. We should probably do a whole nother episode on it because I just listening. I won't go into everything right now, but all I want to say is that little pithy remark that he made about the Maseratis, probably just to, like win the favor of like Wall Street bets or whatever. That's a serious downside of Bitcoin. Yes, tell me the price of Maseratis in Bitcoin, right? And don't tell me the number of dollars of worth of Bitcoin a Maserati is. Tell me the number of Bitcoin a Maserati is. At that point, okay, Bitcoin is now serving as that medium of exchange. If you say it's worth $60,000 payable through Bitcoin in the amount that is equal to $60,000,
right?
Well, that's not Bitcoin. Then you're not paying for it in Bitcoin. You're using Bitcoin to transfer the capital.
Yeah.
But they're dollars that you're transferring.
That distinction is so subtle that it's worth reiterating, but it's so important because what John is essentially saying is the price of the good is in dollars, and they're just willing to accept the current market rate of Bitcoin to dollar, exchange instead. But you can't price something in two different goods or currencies. And the reason you can't do that is because you've created an arbitrage opportunity for anyone like paying attention to your, like you essentially have to keep those two prices constantly updated with each other, or you've created arbitrage opportunities for people.
Right.
And so you can only price your good in one thing. And let's be real, everyone's going to pick dollars. Like I don't think there's a single example of anyone pricing anything
exactly
in Bitcoin that I know of.
Right.
So it's just kind of taken as like a given that it's like, oh, people are adopting, like, oh, we see Bitcoin becoming more and more adopted as more and more people switch to laser eyes on their Twitter Twitter profile and switch their portfolio. Jeez, that was tough to say. Profile and portfolio.
Jeff that was adopted.
What's that?
Excuse?
You're mistaken. It was Jeff that was adopted.
Yeah.
What?
Bitcoin's not
Why
adopted.
did you have to do me
Jeff's
like that, Dylan?
But yes, people just take it as given that transferring their profile to laser eyes and transferring their portfolio to 99% Bitcoin. It's like, yep, I've adopted Bitcoin. It's like, no, you haven't adopted Bitcoin until you've transferred all of your asks for all of the goods that you provide into Bitcoin. And once you've denominated that, Jeff, you nailed it. You've just taken a very inefficient way to run business, where the arbitrageurs are going to come in and price your goods in dollars and transfer into Bitcoin in dollars. So it's just like, that's
Anyway, that's a great combo. Rogo, any concluding thoughts you want to leave the listeners with? Anything you want to get?
Anything you want to plug? Plug to our massive audience.
They could find me.
Yeah, where can our viewers find you?
I'm not going to fall down this track. But I will say my favorite bar in Chicago is Richard's Bar, and
give them your home address.
Only
you
fans.
can find me at Richard's Bar in Chicago on a Saturday.
So we can find him at Richard's Bar on a Friday. That is the best answer to that question that I've ever heard. I love it. Oh, man. All right. Action items for the audience. Buy your flights to Key West now. Prices are going to go up. And make sure your employers gave you that 5% wage bonus.
That's awesome. Where can they find you? I'll probably be at the bar. That's awesome.
I love it.
Thanks for having me on.
All right, dude. Great conversation. Thanks for coming on, Rogo.
Thanks, buddy.
Of course.
Thanks for doing less.